side, about 65% of FDA's volume, the amount of products coming in. The way FDA has historically handled safety, regardless of what the commodity is by building quality and safety into the product from the ground up. Essentially, you design it into the product. And for years, FDA has been able to protect the consumer because so much of the product was manufactured here. Now, however, there's a tremendous amount of finished product coming in from other countries, and the FDA simply doesn't have the resources to do foreign inspections. So they don't have the ability to get the answers to the questions they have about safety because they can't cross the threshold of the facility and be able to get into those companies and be able to inspect them. So what you have left is trying to test product and perhaps catch problems. And finished product testing is certainly valuable, but only as a confirmatory step. You have to make certain that the product is built with quality and with safety in mind, and then you do testing to make certain that your regime, your safety regime, is working. And the way the current regime is set up now with imports, because of the resource problem, largely, the agency is essentially just testing only the finished product. That's all they really have available to them.
And as far as resource, how much of that is a money issue? How much of that is a manpower issue?
It's both. That's a very good question. I would say, I mean, FDA right now, when they recently reported to the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, the number of people, humans, who have responsibilities in managing imported product. And FDA reported that 30 people are full-time, and they're working in a prior notice center. It's a food, basically it's an advanced notice center where data comes in before food arrives, and they're reviewing that data. And then 213 people who are reporting more than 50% of their time on import operations. In the meantime, they're saddled with dealing with probably this year anywhere from 16 to 18 million import shipments. So you're talking about 30, 213. So there's clearly a body problem. There's a lack of human resource problem. But the agency's information technology systems also are antiquated. Unfortunately, the agency, because of the way the resources come to them, they have created information technology systems in their various programs, food programs and safety programs and drug programs, and they don't speak to each other. There's no integration. And so as product comes into the United States, it could be a food, it could be a drug, it could be a device, and that data all comes through one system, but that system can't speak to the other systems to see whether the background data supports that the product is safe or the agency knows something about the manufacturer.
And for those who manufacture, especially in other countries, how open are they to having the United States come and cast that critical eye on how things are being produced?
Well, it depends. In the drug and device industry, because the agency has to approve the product, there's an approval step before the food or before the drug or device hits the U.S. market. A part of that approval is going to be what's called a pre-approval inspection. And so the agency will conduct far more inspections in the drug industry and the device industry than in the food industry. There is that pre-approval step doesn't exist in the food industry. Some countries are very amenable to it. I know that in India, the Ministry of Health has essentially asked for FDA to station people in country, and they would be welcomed there. Other countries, it's a little more challenging. China, I think, is an example where it's more difficult for the agency to move around in that country, and they also have to give advance notice before they show up, as opposed to the United States, where they just all of a sudden they're on your threshold and they come in.
We're talking about U.S. import safety with Benjamin England. Numbers will be on your screen if you want to call and ask him questions. Two more questions of you. This week, the FDA put out the results of a working group looking at a strategy or an action plan to come up with a better way of, I guess, looking at import safety. Of those recommendations, what do you make of them? I could go over the list by list, but just generally, what did the FDA say, and what do you think of that?
Overall, it's a risk-based program, and I think that's absolutely critical. The agency is not going to be able to do it transaction by transaction as cargo comes in. Now, the agency still has to integrate with those transactions. They have to deal with them as they come in. But quite frankly, it's a risk-based program. It focuses on strategies for preventing, in the case of foodborne illnesses, preventing problems, contamination in food. And then it has an intervention component where the agency would target its resources at the highest risk imports. And then there's a response component, strategies in order for the agency to coordinate with other agencies in order to respond more rapidly to foodborne illnesses. That's the framework. The agency asks for a number of new resources, a number of new authorities. What they don't do is ask for resources, and the information technology component of the plan is about a paragraph or two. They do talk about integrating their IT with Customs and Border Protection, which does have to happen, but I just don't see how it can be operationally performed, how they can implement it. And maybe it's just we're too early and we just don't have enough information. But it is true, it must go to a risk-based program because of the volume. There's no way we can possibly, or even should, inspect that volume of cargo coming into the country. And so this really is trying to focus on the highest risks.
And before we go to phones, could you give a biographical sketch of what you have done at the FDA over 17 years?
Sure. I was at FDA for 17 years. I started at as a microbiologist. My undergrad is microbiology at the University of Maryland and Baltimore County. And so I was a microbiologist on the bench for FDA in Baltimore for a number of years, and then went into the inspection side in Baltimore as an inspector. The FDA has compliance officers, which are kind of like paralegals or law clerks, and so I did that for a couple of years. And then the agency in 1992 created an Office of Criminal Investigations, a law enforcement arm, and so I was one of the first special agents that FDA hired, and went to Miami. I went to law school while I was in Miami as a special agent, and converted back to the regulatory side for a couple of years, and was leaving the agency. And the Associate Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs at the time, Dennis Baker, who was the number 2 official in the agency, asked me to stay for a couple of years to help with fixing the agency's import program, because you were already starting to see this incredible increase of volume of cargo coming in. So I agreed to do that, came back to the D.C. area, and then 9/11 happened, and the agency began to obtain new resources and new authorities. So I stayed for an extra year and left in 2003. My last job there was as essentially the attorney or regulatory counsel to the Associate Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs.
And what do you do now?
Now I'm an attorney in a law firm of Jones Walker. It's a New Orleans-based law firm that essentially grew up in the oil industry. But they have some offices around the country, including D.C., and I represent companies that are regulated by the FDA or USDA, and about half of my clients are foreign companies that want to comply with the U.S. before they export to the United States, and the other half are domestic, either as importers or manufacturers, and they run into issues with the agency, and so I provide counsel or I represent them before the government.
Vancouver, Washington, you're first.
Good morning. As a consul, Mr. England, perhaps you could answer this question. Marsha Cross of GAO was on C-SPAN a week or so ago and indicated that perhaps 80% of drugs coming into this country are from India and China. And as you pointed out, there's no way of testing the process by which these drugs are made. My question is, as a citizen, do I have standing to sue the importers to show efficacy and safety of drugs that they import and sell to me as a matter of my prescription drugs?
Interesting question.
Is that